Hi, everyone. Welcome to the training on managing the toll of caregiver trauma and building resiliency in families of children with FASD. This training, I'm thrilled to be a part of it, thrilled that I was asked to host this webinar tonight. It's such an important topic for us as parents of kiddos who are struggling. So this webinar is, of course, made possible by NOFASD Australia. Want to thank them for all of the wonderful and good work they do to support parents who have kiddos or young adults with FASD. My name is Eileen Devine. I'm a licensed clinical social worker. I live in the United States in Portland, Oregon, where I have my private practice therapy called FASD Northwest. So I work with the parents of children whose brains work very differently. They have neurobehavioral conditions of some kind. With an area of expertise in FASD, most of the parents that I work with, their kids either have suspected or confirmed FASD diagnosis. I'm also the parent of a child with FAS, my daughter Maya. And so I tell parents all the time that what I'm encouraging them to do, supporting them to do, asking them to do in terms of parenting from a neurobehavioral perspective, taking care of themselves, practicing those self-care things that are really difficult for all of us to find time for and prioritize, that I understand intimately just how difficult that is. I have that lived experience and that perspective. So I work with families all over the world, actually, working with them using teleconferencing technology, just as we are doing tonight, similarly to what we're doing tonight for this webinar. So consulting with them on, once you know what the neurobehavioral parenting paradigm is about, how do you actually actualize that in your day-to-day parenting with your child? So tonight we're going to be talking about the toll of caregiver trauma, what that is, how to recognize it, and then how to build resiliency within ourselves, within our parenting partnerships, if you're in a parenting partnership, and within our families. So who are we? This is a really important question that I don't think we really ask ourselves and pause to reflect on very often. And it's important for a few reasons. We serve a lot of different roles in our lives. We're a mother or a father, a parent. Oftentimes we are the adult child of parents. We're a sibling. We have occupations, so we serve in those professional roles as well. Some of us think of ourselves as special need parents. We're absolutely advocates for our child. I don't think that you can be the parent of a child with these kinds of challenges and not find yourself in that role of advocate. And we're also caregivers, which is a really interesting role when we think of ourselves as a parent, but also a caregiver to our child. It really adds a uniqueness to that role that not many of us think about. So while we look the same as many of our peers, many other parents around us, we are very different in our experience. Our journey is very unique. And therefore, we need to proceed with that in mind. We need to do things differently for ourselves than a typical parent of a neurotypical child would need to do. So because we don't oftentimes take the time to think about just how different our role is compared to that more quote-unquote normal parenting experience, we oftentimes can fall prey to these ideas such as we just need to power on through this, right? We just need to kind of buck up, be strong. Once we get through this crisis, then maybe we can relax, right? And there's all kinds of reasons why that is not sustainable, and it's also not good for our mental, physical, spiritual health. And it doesn't allow us to be the kind of parent that we all want to be for our kids. So tonight's really talking about taking a step back from that mentality that we can fall prey to, figuring out where are we in terms of this caregiver burnout, compassion fatigue, and then what can we do about it? How do we build resiliency so that we can come out on the other side a better version of ourselves, a stronger, more whole person? So I love this quote. It's from Brene Brown's book, Rising Strong, which I'm going to talk about her work quite a bit tonight. But it really spoke to me in terms of what our experience as parents can be. And I'm going to read it for you. When you are in the middle of a story, it isn't a story at all, but only a confusion, a dark roaring, a blindness, a wreckage of shattered glass and splintered wood, like a house in a whirlwind, or else a boat crushed by the icebergs or swept over the rapids, and all aboard powerless to stop it. It's only afterwards that it becomes anything like a story at all, when you are telling it to yourself or to somebody else. So the other part of tonight is really trying to make sense of our story, right? Oftentimes we can be living in what seems like a whirlwind of chaos. And if we are able to engage with what's going on with us emotionally, and be able to ideally articulate that to someone else and have that support in making sense of it with them, then it becomes a story that makes more sense to us. And we oftentimes can find a better way to see ourselves through it that leaves us again, actually in a better spot, more restored, more resilient on the other end. So tonight we're going to be talking about a few topics here that may sound familiar to you when you read through this list. One of the things that I want to challenge you to do, though, is to really think about how these topics and what we kind of dive into tonight apply to your life specifically, to your partnerships, to your family unit, to how you're feeling internally on a day-to-day basis. Because one of the things that I've come to believe is true is that many things make sense to us cerebrally, and we can intellectualize it, but to actually let it settle and make sense to us emotionally takes a lot of vulnerability, right? It can be a really scary process for some of us. It can be an exhausting process. And so with that understanding, I want to challenge you to be a little vulnerable as you're listening to the information tonight, and to really give thought as to how it may apply to your current experience. The other piece, just to kind of prepare you, is you'll see on this list for these points of discussion, we start with some pretty heavy topics that are, they're emotionally heavy. But we do move into that resilience BC piece and what can we do about all of that. So if you feel yourself feeling weighted down by this information, you're probably, that's an appropriate response, right? And just know that we will get through that and come out the other side in terms of, well, what can we do about it when we are in the thick of it? So when we start to feel stress in our lives, it really starts with what is called relational stress. And this is when the relationship between the person and their environment, or the other people in their environment, is apprised by that person, the person in it, as exceeding his or her resources and endangering his or her well-being. So one of the things that I want to make sure you all heard was that it really is the assessment of the person in it. Is this situation exceeding my resources or endangering my well-being? Oftentimes we have this tendency to look externally for validation. Should I be stressed by this? So-and-so would do a better job managing this. I should just buck up. I should just be stronger. I should just get through it. If you are feeling like your environment or the people in your environment are exceeding your resources, you will feel the stress and the impact of that. It does not matter whether you get external validation for that or not. It's really about your own response to that environment. Our bodies and minds automatically react to stressful situations. They do anything and everything to keep us safe. And that's that fight or flight response, which I'm sure many of you have also seen in your kiddos. We have it too. So when we have that stress that is ongoing and not addressed, our nervous system gets off kilter. So that internal balance is really off and unable to return to its original state. So that's when we start to see the emotional and the physical, mental health side effects of that stress taking place. And that response, if we continue to get into that loop of responding to stress in those maladaptive ways, that becomes an automatic response to the point where sometimes we don't even recognize it when it's happened month after month, year after year. So symptoms of that: isolation, intolerance, lashing out, nagging, lack of intimacy in our relationships, distrust, assaultive behavior, feeling resentful of those around us, irritability and agitation. So these are the moments that when you have these quiet moments by yourself and you think, oh, this is not who I am. Like, how did I end up in this place? When you have that little voice that's telling you that, this is the moment to pause, right? And to really think about, what is the stress? What really is the stress mean to me? How is it impacting me? And what can I do about it? Compassion fatigue, when that relational stress continues and is not addressed, then we have this ongoing snowballing process that leads to compassion fatigue, which is kind of another notch above that relational stress. So it leads to profound shifts in the way that we view the world and that we view loved ones. So a darker, more depressed, more cynical view of the world. We feel emotionally depleted, like we just don't have anything left to give anyone. We're fighting with our partners more often, right? Losing our patience with our kids more easily. One of the things that I want to make sure you all understand about compassion fatigue is that research has shown us, this last point here, that when someone is suffering from compassion fatigue, they work harder and harder with diminishing results. So that is so discouraging to hear for so many of the parents that I work with, because they are working incredibly hard to just get kind of their head above water. But when we talk about implementing self-care, they can't find any possible time or possibility to implement that into their lives. But if they don't do that, if we can't find a way to start that process and make that happen, they're going to continue to work very, very hard with diminished results. Very, very discouraging, right? One of the things that I wanted to talk about with compassion fatigue as well is this element of caregiver burnout. So one of the pieces of compassion fatigue that we might experience is this hypervigilance related to the people that we care for. And that is closely related to caregiver burnout, one of the signs and symptoms of that: the demoralization, disillusionment, cynicism, physical, mental, emotional exhaustion that occurs frequently among those individuals who are responsible for the constant care of another individual. One of the elements that can play into caregiver burnout, making it more profound, is this element of perfectionism, which I've come to believe that many parents who have kids with exceptional needs fall prey to this idea of perfectionism, that if I could just do it better, if I could just be perfect, then these problems here would dissipate, right? It must be me. If I could do a better job parenting, getting things in order, keeping my family together, it's all on me, then these problems wouldn't be occurring, right? So that idea of perfectionism, which is completely unrealistic for any of us, leads to caregiver burnout because it's unattainable. The other thing about caregiver burnout is that there's been research that has talked about it as a contagious syndrome. And what I mean by that is that, or what they mean by that really, is that when you are suffering from caregiver burnout and you are seeking out support from individuals who have that same lived experience, that is incredibly valuable, right? There's a whole lot of reasons why that can really, really help alleviate some of that stress that you feel, the isolation, the loneliness, all of those things. However, if in those groups of individuals with the same lived experience that you're reaching out to for support, if there is no talk about what can we do, what are some positive steps that we can do to support each other and get out of this dark place, make things better, it's actually going to only contribute to the caregiver burnout that everyone in that group is experiencing. So I would keep that in mind when you're seeking out support, whether it's in person, whether it's online, in Facebook groups, whatever it might be, asking yourself that question: is this group also helping, allowing me to vent, a very important piece, but also are we lifting each other up, trying to really be proactive and talk about how to get to a better space? Otherwise, it may be doing more harm than good. The last piece about caregiver burnout is we can get to a point where we don't even realize that we've reached this extreme point of stress and the buildup of stress leading to this burnout because of we become desensitized to our own experience. So you may have experienced this when you are talking with another parent about maybe an event that happened at your house, how the last night went, something that happened with your child that was especially challenging. And you see the look on their face that gives you this instant recognition of, oh my gosh, they have no idea what I'm talking about, right? This experience is unique enough, intense enough, different enough that it's outside of the realm of even possibility for them as a parent. But we become desensitized to it to the point where we don't even realize that experience is traumatic, is incredibly stressful, and is so stressful that it's led us to burnout without even realizing that we're there. So to be mindful again of the intensity that our parenting experience can bring at times and the profound impact that can have on us. One of the ways that this experience can impact us is with our physical health. So there's a wonderful book called The Body Keeps Score, and it's actually about the impact of trauma on our physical well-being. I would encourage you, if you're interested in this particular aspect of it, to definitely pick that book up or get it on Audible. Because when we talk about our experience as parenting a child who has very challenging behaviors, where we have to be in this hypervigilant, always on guard kind of mode, many of us, for weeks, months, years at a time, that is traumatic to our system, to our psyche, and also to our physical health. And there's real impacts of that. So the Body Keeps Score are cortisol levels. Cortisol is our body's alarm system. So it fuels that fight or flight response. It's our primary stress hormone. And it creates, the stress creates these high cortisol levels within our body. So when we have high cortisol levels, we have symptoms that most of us would think of as stress, symptoms of stress: feeling high strung or unable to relax, anxiety, our mind spinning, not being able to relax, no appetite or eating everything, right? Everyone's a bit unique with that one, but either impacting our appetite in one way or another. Weight gain, which usually is around the belly area. Indigestion issues, it can cause fertility issues. So there's a whole lot of reasons why it's important that our cortisol levels be in check. So you may feel those symptoms that I've just described for months or even years, and then one minute, one day, it's poof, our adrenal glands can no longer keep up. The stress has been ongoing and high for so long that our adrenal glands give out. So then it's bye-bye to our cortisol levels. And when that happens, we have an impact like extreme chronic fatigue, not being able to muster up the energy for our day-to-day activities, feeling foggy, trouble concentrating, depression, anxiety. Those little boosts like caffeine don't have the impact that they used to have, unstable blood sugar levels. So either one is not good for our body, right? We want to make sure that our cortisol levels are in check, but when we have stress, especially ongoing chronic stress, then it can take our body out of whack in some pretty significant ways. That constant stress keeps that alarm button on, and then over time, like I said, it gives out, and there's a whole host of other symptoms, devastating symptoms that happen. The other perfect recipe for burnout, especially in the unique parenting experience that we're talking about, is this level of expectation versus average level of performance. So I'm sure that many of you have heard of dysmaturity and how it impacts your child, your kiddos with FASD, that gap between the chronological age and the developmental age. So I've not ever worked with a family with parents who have a child with FASD where that wasn't present, where it wasn't key in understanding their child, where it wasn't something that they had to grapple with, something that they needed to really take the time to understand intimately. It's also, as I'm sure many of you have experienced, something that we can easily forget when our children look so neurotypical. When we have a child where their average level of performance with day-to-day tasks, their emotional social development is much below the level of expectation that we would have of a child of that chronological age, there's that chronic discrepancy. If we forget that, if we don't understand that, if we can't make sense of that, then we will constantly be coming up against stress, frustration, disappointment that leads to this burnout. The other piece that is specific to kiddos with FASD is that they have these on and off days, right? They can do it one day, and that's an A day, and then the next day they can't do it without a whole lot of support, and that's their F day. And if we as parents don't understand that that is a classic symptom that they have as a result of their physical disability, or we forget, then we have this random reinforcement that keeps us thinking, oh, they did it yesterday. Of course they can do it today. Why can't they do it today? And we get agitated, we get frustrated, we get sad, right? That they've had something the day before that they simply cannot do. That inconsistent performance gives us random reinforcement about what our child's ability truly is, right? Versus what they're not able to do on other days. And again, if we can't make sense of that, we can't remember that, then it leads to burnout because we're constantly trying to set those expectations at a place where some days they simply just can't meet them. Characteristics of compassion, fatigue, and burnout. I want you to think, while you look at this list, which ones of these, how many of these apply to your life or have applied to your life over the course of the last 6 months to a year, right? These characteristics, they develop over time. That snowball effect that we talked about earlier. They are physical in nature. They also have mental health components. They have spiritual components. There's numbing behaviors that are involved. Things like feeling irritable, helpless, and hopeless, right? Feelings of despair. So this is more than just a lack of motivation in your life. It really is a slow shutting down process, this chronic feeling of inertia that you just can't find it in you to do the seemingly simple things that you once did. And again, it can sneak up on us because we are desensitized to it, because compassion fatigue and burnout happens over a long period of time when we are not dealing with that or relational stress when it first sets in. It has a way of sneaking up on us where it's those moments we take a step back and we think, whoa, this is not the place that I want to be, right? I need to do something to get out of it. But how do you get out of it when you're feeling chronic discomfort, fear, anger, depressed, feeling isolated? We're going to talk about that. So another component, another aspect of this caregiver trauma that I want to spend a little more time talking about is the feeling of grief and the grief process that we experience as a parent of a child with significant challenges. So grief is oftentimes, in my experience, the emotion that we avoid at all costs, right? It's much easier to be mad, to be angry, than to be sad. And so we do everything we can to run from it, to push it down, to deny it's there, but it doesn't go away. It remains, and it manifests itself in these ways that we're talking about with our mental health, our physical health, our spiritual health. So Brene Brown, who I mentioned earlier, she has a wonderful book called Rising Strong. If you're not familiar with her work or that book, I would encourage you to pick it up. It's a great book, and I feel like the concepts in it relate a lot to our parenting journey. And so she talks about grief specifically in that book as being comprised of these three components. So the loss of what could be, longing, which is yearning for meaning, yearning for understanding, or longing for what you now know just will not be. Those moments of longing can have the same upwellings of grief as anything else, right? They kind of come out of nowhere, things that you didn't even know you cared about, things you didn't even know that you were longing for, suddenly engulf you, right? In this grief that you didn't even know was there. Feeling lost. So attempting to reorient ourselves to our physical and our emotional and our social worlds. So this is when nothing feels quite right. It doesn't feel normal. Everything is off, or even feeling frozen, feeling like things happen to you that you don't have any control, and that just life is not meaningfully organized. You just can't quite seem to make sense of what's going on. So I talked about the darkness that grief can bring, and I think that when we are in the midst of parenting a child with significant challenges, especially as they get older, and the expectations for them rise exponentially with their chronological age, but we see very clearly that that gap is getting greater, or maybe not getting greater, we just see it more clearly with that dysmaturity piece, that's when the grief can really come up in those moments for us. Another thing about grief that I think is tricky and challenging is that we can feel really sure of ourselves, we can feel really stable in our experience, and then something this small seemingly happens that brings up this grief for us, and we can be pulled under this wave before we even know that what's happened to us. It can sneak up on us and take us under in a moment's notice. And so again, to not understand that that's a grief process that we're working through is to our disadvantage in terms of being able to go through it and come out the other side with making more sense of that story that we talked about earlier. So disenfranchised grief, when I do these trainings in person, I always ask folks if they've heard of this term, and most of the time people have not. It describes our experience nearly perfectly in my estimation. Disenfranchised grief is loss that is not socially sanctioned. It's not openly acknowledged. It's not recognized by others, and it's not publicly mourned. So when we have someone who passes away who's close to us, all of these things happen, right? It's socially sanctioned. People openly acknowledge our loss. It's recognized by others, and we have ways to publicly mourn the loss of that person. When you have a child who has incredible challenges and a physical brain-based disability that is invisible to many and misunderstood by many, then those losses, those repeated losses that we experience as their parent, right? They don't meet developmental milestones. You see them struggling socially and emotionally in different situations. Their peers are getting way far ahead of them in certain areas that you thought they'd be able to keep up in. All of those kinds of things. It's not socially sanctioned. It's not openly acknowledged. It's usually not recognized by others for what it is, and it's not publicly mourned. So in the moments where we need human connection the most, right, in our grief experience, is oftentimes where we feel the most alone. So how does grief look? How does it present? Very similarly to that chronic stress and that compassion fatigue and that caregiver burnout. It can be physical with tension in the body, headaches, fatigue, heaviness, those colds that just never go away and that come more frequently than they do for anyone else. You can have emotional impacts, of course, depression, anxiety, being tearful, but being easily provoked, jealousy. I run virtual support groups for parents of children with FASD and have people from all over the world really participate in those small groups. And we had an interesting discussion about this jealousy piece, because the mom who was sharing that was saying that she felt awful for being jealous of other parents whose kids didn't have the same struggles. She felt like she was a bad person. There was a lot of shame there. But when we were able to talk more about it and she was able to reframe it as her grief experience, she was able to be more gentle with herself, right? And to then make sense of it, make sense of what that was all about for her. Cognitive, being foggy, impulsive, reckless. Behavioral, shutting down, isolating, withdrawing, lashing out, yelling. Again, these are what I call those quiet moments where we've just had something happen in a relationship in our family where we've lashed out, we've yelled, we've been especially irritable. We think to ourselves, why was I like that? That's not who I am. That's not who I want to be. That's not who I used to be, right? Maybe it's grief. And then spiritual ramifications. So losing faith in God and a higher power in a greater good, hopelessness. The other ways that I think this can present itself is things like feeling like your life has narrowing possibilities. What used to seem, a future that used to seem quite expansive, full of possibilities, has now really narrowed. Also having very little tolerance for what you would think of as the pettiness of other parents who are expressing their challenges and concerns about their quote unquote neurotypical children, right? And then feeling bad about that later, right? Why can't I listen to them? Their concerns have value, right? But feeling this agitation as they're telling you about what they see as a big deal. And you're saying, if you only knew. That could be grief at work there, right? So none of that is bad. None of that should be something we feel shameful about, but we do need to make sense of it, because if we don't make sense of it, then it's going to continue to come up in these ways that are described here. And that really has that very serious and profound impact on our health. So I'm guessing that most of you have been exposed or heard about these stages of grief. What I want to say about this is that those stages of grief really just help us describe a grief experience. It puts a framework to it to help us identify what we might be feeling, make sense of it. They do not go in order, unfortunately. They're not nice and neat. We can jump all over the place through those 5 stages in our experience. They're not linear. And they're not time bound. They don't have any sort of neat timelines. The reason why I mention this is because what I often see in parenting partnerships, when we're working on, how to make sense of their experience as parenting a child with significant needs, and how to find connection in their own relationship and with their child, oftentimes we get to grief. It's almost always present in one form or another, and so it's hard not to talk about it. And what we find is that 2 parents in a parenting partnership can oftentimes be in the same situation, right? The same household, parenting the same child, both experiencing grief, but it looks very, very different. One of them might be in denial when the other one is in acceptance, or one of them might be in anger when the other one's in depression or acceptance. So those 2 stages of that grief process are going to look very different, and oftentimes can get very confusing for the people in it. It can seem like, man, we are not at all seeing this situation the same, when in fact, you're in the same grief experience, just at different places. So again, at the point where we need to be connected the most, where we're all wired for human connection, when we're experiencing grief, it's one of those moments where we need that connection the most. If we don't understand that we can be at different places in our own grief processes, that can drive disconnection, right? And make it all that much harder to heal from it and to go through it, come out better on the other end. I love this slide because I think it's so accurate. Those stages of grief and then my experience. As I was saying before, it would be so nice if the grief process was nice and neat, where we knew exactly where it was going to lead and when we'd come out the other end. But unfortunately, it's not. It's very messy, like you see under that my experience. The other thing is that we can move, as I said before, I know in my own personal parenting journey, I've moved from that fear to searchings to panic, right? What does this mean for the future of my child? What does this mean for my future? So on and so forth. And then into new strengths and hope and helping others. But then one small incident can just take me under again, right? I can feel like I'm on such firm ground, and something like my daughter expressing to me the other week, why don't I ever go to birthday parties? Her brother, our neurotypical son, is at that age where he's going to birthday parties every month, it seems, right? And so she's just starting to have that awareness and realize that that's not her experience. And so that kind of conversation can take me right back under, right? Just in sadness for her, the isolation and the loneliness that she feels in that. So that brings up another unique piece in our experience as parenting a child with fetal alcohol spectrum disorders. Our grief that we can experience within that for all the reasons we've talked about, and also understanding that at a certain age, our children will go through their own grief experience related to their differences, related to how difficult things are for them when they start to recognize that and understand why that is. So at the same time that we're managing our own grief, then we have this great responsibility to help our child through theirs. So it gets complicated and it gets stressful and it gets heavy and it's very difficult very quickly. I want to acknowledge that, right? And again, help you to hopefully understand that your parenting experience is so much more intense and emotionally depleting than a typical parenting experience. And therefore, the self-care and the attention that you need that give yourself needs to match that. Needs to be all that more intensive as well. So where do our strong feelings about behaviors come from, and why are we talking about this? So the emotional reactions that we have to our child's behaviors is really, really important to our mental health. When they clash with our deeply held values, our deeply held beliefs, when we're triggered, we have that visceral knee-jerk reaction to their behaviors, we have strong, instantaneous emotions that come from that. Even when you have been practicing the neurobehavioral parenting model for years, and most of the time you have that under control, we can still get triggered on a moment's notice. That has mental and physical ramifications for us. One of the ways that this manifests itself is through that idea of dysmaturity. So when we have these age-based expectations that are very appropriate, very good, nothing wrong with these, all these act your age at 6 years old expectations for a 6-year-old, and then these act your age at 16-year-old, when our children are meeting those expectations at that chronological age, everything is right. Everything's good in the world. We have no stress, right? Everything is as it should be. But when we have a child who is chronologically 6, but is 3 developmentally, and so they cannot compromise, share, and take turns. That's still a skill that they need to learn. Maybe they're very behind in their academics, so they're not keeping up with their peers in learning numbers and letters. They're not starting to read. They can't follow those 3-step directions. They can't sit still in school and listen for 20 minutes. There can be, again, either that grief experience, frustration, stress, shame. How does this reflect on me as their parent, right? And at the age of 16, chronologically 16, but what if your child is 8 developmentally? All of a sudden, these expectations really make no sense at all. We want our child to be responsible. There's nothing wrong with that expectation. But the way that we teach a child who's 8 to be responsible versus a 16-year-old looks very, very different. So when we have a child who should be working towards increased independence, should be thinking about their future and planning for their future, and really they are only 8 developmentally, that can be a source of friction with us if we don't understand that. It can be a source of great sadness, that grief, again, coming up, frustration, anger. It can drive disconnection with our children if we don't understand that emotional reaction, and able to take that step back and think, why are things the way they are? What does this have to do with their disability? So engaging with emotions and getting curious. We've talked a lot about engaging with our emotions and why that's important, that in order to understand what our story is, in order to articulate it, make sense of that chaos that we feel we're swirling in sometimes, we have to understand that we're having an emotional reaction, which is actually much harder than it sounds, right? Most of us, again, will try to do anything we can to get away from that emotion if it is difficult for us to tolerate it, which many of these emotions are. So in Brene Brown's work, in that book, Rising Strong, that I mentioned, she calls this reckoning with our emotions. When we have, she describes it as this face down in the arena moment. When we are face down in the arena, we've just had our butt kicked, we have dirt smeared on our face, and what are we going to do to rise strong? What do we need to do so that we can get off that dirt floor and rise strong and continue with our lives? And engaging with the emotion is that first step. Even just recognizing that you're having an emotional reaction is that first step, because then you can do something about it. When you are curious about something, you want to know more about it, automatically, just by being curious about it, you're asking it to get bigger, right? So instead of denying the emotion, stuffing it down, you're saying, okay, I'm experiencing something, like this doesn't feel quite right. I'm having an emotional reaction to this. I wonder what that's about. And just by asking that question, you're asking that very thing to get bigger rather than smaller. And when we can remain curious about something, then that shame and self-criticism can slowly melt away. It can't be there present with the curiosity. So that really is the first step. The opposite of recognizing we're feeling something is to deny emotions. And when we disengage from tough emotions, they don't go away. Instead, they own us, they define us, right? So there's really no getting away from them, but we try really hard. And there's 3 typical ways that I see people try to offload their emotion. One is moving away. So this is, and I want you to think about which 3 of these categories you typically fall into, and maybe think about your partner as well. Moving away, so shutting down, retreating, isolating, just disappearing. The second way is moving towards, and so this means trying to make everything okay, but at a great personal sacrifice. So people pleasing, right? Instead of engaging with that emotion, you're just going to try to make everything else better. So that you can stay occupied and not have to think about what's going on here, but it comes at a great personal cost. Or moving against. These are the people that come out swinging, right? That's the way that they offload emotion, with anger, with lashing out, that more demonstrative show of emotion. And I always say, there's been very few times where, when I'm working with a parenting partnership, when we're talking about a partner who offloads emotion in that way, with the anger, the lashing out, explosive behavior, that what is underlying that in so many of the cases is grief that they don't feel comfortable expressing, sadness, and fear, right? Fear for their child, fear for what this means for themselves. So in a marriage and a partnership, It's very easy to see how that offloading would happen onto the other person, because we often do that with the people who are closest to us, the safest people. It's more difficult to lash out at our child's provider, at their teachers, the people that we're really upset with. And so we do that with those closest to us. And again, just like I talked about in the grief process, when we're doing that, those are the people that we need closest to us, that we need to be most connected with to help get us through that emotion, whatever that might be. But when we offload emotion and make a habit of it, that just drives disconnection with that person. We feel more and more distant from them. So once we have recognized our emotion, that engaging with it versus running away from it or stuffing it down, then we have more that we can do in terms of our actions and our behaviors. So some of the ways to recognize emotion, again, through those physical responses, our body keeps score. It tells us what's going on with the rest of our body, with our mind, with our spiritual well-being. When we are yelling at our spouse for no reason, when we want to punch a wall, when we want to harm other people that are around us, we want to hide, we want to retreat. Or do we have compulsive behaviors that have really gotten out of control, where maybe we were enjoying a glass of wine once a week, and then it was every night, now it's a bottle, right? That slow creeping up of compulsive behaviors that are now at a point that are out of control. So connecting those thoughts, actions, and behaviors and addressing all three equally. So this is something that therapists, cognitive behavioral therapists, are really skilled in. If that's something that you have access to, you're able to get that support, that would be a wonderful way to begin this process. What I want to make note of are depression and anxiety specifically, because I think oftentimes those are the two emotions that are most socialized in our societies. And so we have a good understanding of what that means to feel depressed or feel anxious. Many of us do. And what I want to say about this is that if you are feeling depression and anxiety, I'd like you to think about that as your body's first reaction to stockpiles of hurt that you may be experiencing. That's like our body's first sign, like, hey, there's buildup here that's not being addressed. We really need to do something to work this out, again, within our nervous system, within our mind, within our heart, right? Depression and anxiety are two of the body's first reactions to stockpiles of hurt. Numbing emotional pain. So when we don't engage, again, the emotions don't go away, but something needs to happen with them. We can't stuff them forever, even though we try. And so we often turn to ways to numb them. So these are some of the common ways that I see parents doing that. But there might be some on here that you haven't really thought about, like points of view, getting our heels dug in to a point of view where we can't consider any other perspective. The glass being half empty. Again, that kind of more cynical, darker view of the world. The loyalty to suffering. When I'm doing this training in person, someone always asks about that one. So I will just assume that that might be a question out there and answer it. What I mean by that is that we can get stuck in suffering, especially when it's become kind of a destination point. So we find ourselves suffering, we can't see our way out of it. When you numb in that way, then you are stuck there, right? There's not really anywhere else to go. If you are presented with an alternative perspective, for example, what we're talking about today, where you can engage with that emotion and start to slowly and gently walk through it and figure out what does this mean for you and what's going on. There are people who get stuck in that suffering because they are unsure of the outcome of doing anything different. So it's, I'm suffering, I don't enjoy this is really hard, but at least I know this kind of hard. At least I know this kind of pain. It's familiar to me now. And you're telling me things might be better over there, but what if they're not? What if they're worse? I'm just going to stay here. I'm just going to stay stuck. So one of the things that Dr. Brown in her research has found, so it's not just her opinion, her research has found that we cannot selectively numb emotions. So when we numb the dark, the really hard things, the really hard emotions, we also numb the light. Okay, so I really want you to think about that. If you have some ways that you are numbing your emotional pain, to know that if you continue to do that, to really numb those dark, hard feelings, you're also going to be diminishing the light that has the potential of coming through. So resilience. This is where we start to talk about what the heck can we do about all this, right? So we've talked about a few things. We've talked about that process of engaging with our emotions. Again, very sounds much easier than it is. Remaining curious about our experience, not being critical of what our experience may be, self-criticism, really trying to fight up against that shame that often can creep in as well. Making sense of our story so that we can then just very gently begin to walk through it with support, oftentimes, to come out a more whole person on the other side. To do all of that, you really need to have resilience. So I want to talk for a minute about what exactly resilience is, because I think we can, many people have misconceptions about it. So resilience is not a fixed characteristic. I think a lot of people feel like either you are a resilient person or you're not. It's just an innate quality. Like it's the way you were raised, right? The way your upbringing. And that's actually just simply not true. We all have the ability to become more resilient people. So that's the good news. Becoming resilient is a lifelong practice, and you have to work regularly at building it. So that's kind of the hard news, because it's how do you become more resilient? You do it. And we're going to talk about some pretty concrete ways, but nobody can do it for you. And it has to be a lifelong practice, and you have to do it regularly. It's not about pushing through or soldiering on. So I think oftentimes when we think of a resilient person, we think, oh, they just push right through that hard, situation. They just kind of get through it. They just buck up and pull themselves up by their bootstraps and they soldier on. That's actually not what resilience is. And by doing that, you will diminish the resiliency that you have built up. What it is our ability to meet the challenges we encounter each day, trusting that we have the internal and external resources to meet those challenges with the least amount of negative consequences to our physical, emotional, and spiritual selves. Okay, so it's building up that ability to weather those storms. It means that we can hold space for whatever our experiences might be, regardless of what they look like from the outside. So this is a big one for us, right? When we have a child who is incredibly misunderstood, and so because of that, we as parents are oftentimes very misunderstood. Their diagnosis is misunderstood, all of those sorts of things. We need to be able to hold space for what our experience is as the parent of this child, regardless of what others' perceptions are, right? It's a really, really hard thing to do, but it's resilience. It's about recognizing when we're dysregulated, overwhelmed, and honoring the appropriateness of that response. So this isn't going to come as any surprise to any of you, that this is a really, really tough one as well when we're parenting children who have diminished ability to regulate themselves. They become overwhelmed very quickly. And we need to be able be our best version of ourselves to be regulated to help them with that, right? When they are not regulated and relating to us, they cannot reason, nor can we reason with them. So recognizing that when we are in those moments and we are dysregulated and we are overwhelmed, even though we're trying very, very hard not to be, knowing that that's because we're human, right? We are not going to get it perfect every time. And this is really hard work. It is as hard as we think it is, right? So Being resilient doesn't mean soldiering on and pushing through that. It means understanding that and then knowing what you can do about it. That leads to the last point of being aware of our own nervous systems, our patterns of arousal, what triggers us, what are those knee-jerk reactions about, so that we can maintain our regulation, so that we have the greatest possibility of doing that, which of course helps our children regulate. I'm going to now show you some images of resilience. And I want you to think about how these images and what I'm going to talk about here apply to your life. Okay? What are some ways that you can become more resilient? Where are you finding that your resilience is being chipped away, where you need to really focus and build it up? So you're stretched too thin, you're barely hanging on, and something has to give. What's it going to be? What can you move off your plate to make room for other things like self-care, like restorative time that you need, rest, quiet, right? What can you delegate? Things that do not have to be done by you, right? Somebody could do them for you. Maybe they wouldn't do them as well, but they could still do them for you. What obligations have you made, volunteer obligations, for example, that no longer bring you joy? It doesn't fill your bucket up anymore. Can you let go of that to make more time for yourself and your well-being to build up that resilience? Building resilience by reducing our feelings and sense of isolation. So I've said several times now, we are all wired for connection with other people, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, it's there. It just may look really different. And so if you are feeling isolated in your life, isolated in your experience, how can you make room for more connection with other people? And what does that look like? What are, under the best conditions, the way that you prefer to connect with other people? Is it one-on-one? Is it in a small group? Is it in a quiet setting, right? Do you feel isolated from your partner, living under the same roof, but feeling really isolated in your experience and your relationship? What can you do to increase that connection? I had a couple that I was working with, and what we brainstormed for them was coming up, they were having they could not find adequate childcare for their kiddos, which is really common. And so they planned to have a date night at home with their kids watching a movie in another room. And they set a timer where they could talk about logistical household things for X number of minutes. And then once that timer went off, no more talk. No more talk about the kids and the challenges and logistics that had to happen between them for parenting. It was just about them and their time to connect. So what would that look like for you to reduce that isolation and make room for more social connection? How do you reduce that feeling that all sides are coming down on you? That you are just barely able to keep yourself above water? Does your partner know the extent to which you feel this way? Do your closest friends have any idea the desperation that you feel in these moments? We can't assume that people read our minds. It'd be wonderful if in these instances they could, right? We didn't have to articulate our needs to them. But even those who know us best may not know that in those moments of feeling like all the walls are caving down on us, that we desperately need their help. And so have you really articulated concretely to those closest to you what you need from them, right? Oftentimes, I believe that people really do want to help, but because of that disenfranchised grief, they don't know that that's our experience. It's not recognized. It's not socially sanctioned. They don't know what to do, right? Even if they did recognize it, they just don't know how to respond. And so if we can give them really concrete ways to help us, I think that most people are very willing to help alleviate some of that despair that might be present there. I feel like this is the perfect image of resilience, some life coming up through a concrete. And what it reminds me of are those times when things are quite dark in our parenting experience, and thinking about what are those things that you think could help kind of lift you up out of that dark hole. help you see light and see life in the places where it's been quite dark. So seeking counsel, right? So if that's spiritual counseling, if it's finding a therapist who's just for you, right? There's no connection to your child unless you want to have that be part of your discussion with them. It's not one of your child's providers. It is someone there just for you and supporting you in your journey. Is it about talking to maybe your primary care physician about medication? So oftentimes we don't necessarily, we have some resistance to it or resistance to medication, or we don't think of that necessarily. But medications don't have to be long-term. An antidepressant can be what helps kind of get you out of that dark hole so that then you can begin to think more clearly again. That fogginess disappears, and you can then actually put in some self-care strategies to help alleviate that depression completely, and then maybe you don't need that medication anymore. So thinking about that, the darkness that you might find yourself in and what will bring you some light and some life. So you could look at this image as someone that's barely hanging on. I see it as someone who is strong and focused and determined and quite resilient. And so what are the conditions where you know you thrive? When do you feel you're most resilient? Those are the things that need to be a part of your regular practice, right? When we talked about the good news is that you can become more resilient. The bad news is that you have to be the one to do it. And that small steps in the bucket, the small drops in the bucket, actually do build upon each other and make you a more resilient person. So what is it? What are those conditions where you know you thrive? And where do you need to make changes to have more of that? So some other steps of wellness: take stock what's on your plate, really thinking very clearly about that. Again, what are some things that you're doing that you don't have to be the one to do? The division of labor in our partnerships oftentimes gets set up very early on, and we don't revisit it on a regular basis. So maybe that's something that needs to happen. Do you have to be the one to take your child to all the appointments? Do you have to be the one to sit in every school meeting with the school teachers? Or can you split that responsibility with your partner if you're in a parenting partnership? Who are those friends that you've thought of asking for help, but you've never asked? You've never said anything to them. What's keeping you from doing that, right? What would it take for you to really reach out to them and let them know what you need from them? Reevaluating priorities and expectations and delegating. Just talked about those two. Finding support. So again, individual therapists, marital therapists, online or in-person support groups. I mentioned that I run virtual support groups with people all over the world, which is a great source of support for some folks. Just keep in mind what I said about that caregiver fatigue and burnout being contagious, right? Make sure that it's places that where they're talking about solutions and proactive strategies and what you can do to really help yourself get to a better place, to balance out the venting and all of that piece of it. Slowing down to observe and gain perspective, right? Oftentimes when we're swirling in this chaos, this is very hard to do, but to be able to take that step back, just like we need to when we're parenting from that neurobehavioral perspective, taking that step back to gain perspective and observe, figure out what's going on, taking that deep breath. Committing to finding balance. Those baby steps are still steps forward. And when we're looking at balance, I encourage folks to look after these basic three. So how is your eating? How are you feeling about your sleeping? Are you doing things for movement every day or exercise every day, whatever you choose to call it? When we have all of those heavy, really difficult emotions like depression and anxiety and grief, that sits in our nervous system. It literally sits there and needs to be metabolized. It needs to be worked out of our body. And exercise and movement is a perfect way to do that. If possible, seek out respite. I know that's not a possibility for a lot of folks. I also have worked with a lot of parents who have the possibility of respite, but it's a whole heck of a lot of steps and paperwork and stress to get to that point. So is there someone in your life, if that's your case, that can help you get through that mountain of paperwork and all of the red tape that is required to get to that respite, right? Because if you can find respite, that is, as every one of you can imagine, a huge, huge piece of building resilience and getting the self-care you need. And then having a concrete plan. So oftentimes we can listen to things like the information talked about today and think like, oh yeah, that's me. She's talking about me. I should really do something about it. And then we go back to our life and never to think about it again. So while I am thrilled that you are all listening to this, I also really want you to take action, right? And having a concrete plan, writing it down, what are a few things that you can do tomorrow and in the next week to build your resiliency and reduce your stress? It does not have to be really time intensive. It doesn't have to be grand plans. It can be very small things. Having that concrete plan and then sharing it with others for accountability, right? That always helps with most of us in terms of motivation, sticking with it. And then stop neglecting what you know keeps you well. I say a lot that when we talk about self-care, I think just in society at large, there's this idea that it's things like massages and bubble baths, which are actually really wonderful things. Nothing wrong with those. But when we have this unique parenting experience, I think we're talking about something completely different, right? It's not about, wow, that would be really nice, and if I have time for it, then that would be wonderful, but I can take it or leave it. With our parenting experience, our lives literally depend on our self-care practices, right? For all of the reasons we've talked about, our mental health, our physical health, and our spiritual health. So it really isn't optional to not take in even just those baby steps forward when you're living in this unique parenting paradigm. All right, so here is my contact information. If you want to reach out to me for any reason, I would love to hear from you. On my website, I also have a tab there for blog posts. I try to write a monthly blog post about topics that are relevant to the parents that I work with. And so feel free to check those out. There's actually one on the toll of caregiving trauma and a whole host of other topics. But those are there for you if you find them helpful. Many parents have said that it's not only helped them articulate their experience, but they've been helpful to pass on to family members and close friends to help those family member and close friends understand their experience. So feel free to do that if you find them helpful. All right, we will have another webinar coming out shortly. And so I look forward to that. In the meantime, please take care of yourself, and thank you so much for watching. Take care.